an inquiry after 21 years.
Yes.
Given the fact that your report points out that there were crucial loss of evidence in terms of vital wire tapes, being lost out, being erased by the intelligence agencies. What was the possibility of, doing any kind of justice after an inquiry that happens 21 years after the whole incident has taken place?
The answer to your question is it better to do what you can with an inquiry or not? So there wasn't going to be any harm come from the inquiry. Now, I should tell you that the RCMP always had an open file, but nothing seemed to be happening. Eventually, they raised the hulk of the plane and patched it together, and they could determine from that where the explosion in the plane took place. They had suspects. They arrested 3 people, Bagra, Malik, and Riyadh. Riyadh pleaded guilty to manslaughter, said he was building a bomb to blow up a bridge in Italy. The other 2 pled not guilty. The RCMP, to their credit, that trial was very thoroughly investigated. But again, what happened in part, Riyadh committed perjury at the trial. He's now either been sentenced to another 10 years. The CSIS had 2 women who were good witnesses, but the RCMP scared them just by their tactics. So when they gave evidence, they had a loss of memory. So the trial judge was left with 2 of the women who no longer had any memory, and Riyadh, who had committed perjury. So there was, to him, some doubt, and he had to acquit. Well, that acquittal renewed the exasperation that all these people were murdered and nobody is accountable.
Yeah.
And I think that was the final push to have an inquiry to see, well, what did happen? And can it happen again?
There are a lot of points, that actually have been recommended by you. We will come down to them also. But the fact that a lot of evidence was lost out, a lot of lapses were there. We shouldn't have been there. Maybe you're giving it as a matter of recommendation for any future, a caution that the authorities might exercise. But the fact remains that who should be held accountable for those vital losses? Now, maybe in terms of the wiretaps which were erased, the way the investigative agencies had been going on, it seemed that they were particularly not interested in getting down to the bottom of the truth. They were way into the trial. I mean, certain things started happening when the trial had already started, and there had to be critical media reports to get the investigative agencies into action.
You have to understand, when you're dealing with spies and intelligence, there's a certain paranoid. But when this system was set up, CSIS was to collect collect intelligence, but not evidence. So that their instructions were, after you've listened to the tape, erase it. Now, that seems not to make any sense. Nonetheless, that was the instructions. You collect intelligence only.
And then even after the tragedy had happened, after the investigation had started, then there were no requests made by the Royal Canadian Police to have certain things kept recorded. Even there were no suggestions way into the trial.
Well, after the plane crashed, they kept making recordings and destroying them. Now, people have criticized that, saying, well, we understand you had orders initially, in the usual case, to destroy the intelligence after you passed it to the RCMP. But surely, an unusual circumstance like an airplane blown up and 329 people killed, you keep everything. Well, they had a spy mentality. The rules said erase, they erased. Eventually, I think it was a couple of months before they started keeping them, keeping the tapes, which should have been kept, obviously, from the time the plane crashed, and even earlier, perhaps. That was a judgment decision that they made as to how they were going to operate. This goes back to criticism of the RCMP years ago in Quebec when there was a separatist government, and they claimed the RCMP were pulling dirty tricks. And they had an inquiry. And out of that inquiry, it was decided that the RCMP should be police and not get involved
into other
in
activities.
dirty tricks. That's for spies. Thus, you get CSIS, the spies. But they had no training. It was, and unfortunately, the accident happened when they were still in their infancy.
True.
Today, it's much better. You may have seen in my report, I have one criticism. I think there should be a single national advisor. The national advisor would determine territorial disputes. You see, what happens when you're collecting intelligence, you might think you have a spy ring. And as part of that intelligence, you know there's a break and entry. Well, the break and entry is insignificant compared to the spy ring. So CSIS doesn't want to tell them about the break and entry. If they tell them, they arrest them and they blow up the...
True.
So that's the general rationale.
But these are very fundamental things which should have been at the top of the mind of the rulers of the day. The way they are kind of splitting the forces, and then there is no mutual sync or coordination amongst them. The way one thing is being gathered and it is not being used by the other. So the fact is that it was the immaturity of the system. Today, if we don't want to point out responsibilities to some person, which may be an X, Y, or Z, but then certainly the whole system is to be blamed the way the justice could not be done.
Well, you can always attach blame, and then you add an excuse. And the excuse was they were in their first year of operation. That's no comfort to the people that were on the plane. We were told at the commission that things are much better. They communicate quite freely. We expressed skepticism in the report, saying that at any one time it could be going better, but you need to have permanency. That's why you need a national advisor, one man who looks at it and says belongs to CSIS, or it belongs to the RCMP, or it belongs to both. The system, as you point out, in 1985 was inadequate. We hope 2011 it's much better. And how do you know?
In the light of what you're saying, as there were inadequacies of the system, there were inherent lapses, inherent shortcomings in the system, but the fact that the whole conspiracy could not be unraveled. This brings us to a very important point. Going again back on the way the investigations went on till 1995, the speed of the investigations was very slow. Yeah. So was one reason of this investigation being so slow and tardy the fact that the plane was of Air India? Because your report does point out at one point in time that because Air India had been crying, they wanted additional security free of cost, but the Canadian establishments of the time thought that they were just crying wolves, and they were making much ado about nothing. The fact remains that the plane got blown up apart. Where do you think, and this kind of thing is always the mind of the people sitting here in India, that since the plane belonged to Air India, and a lot of people who were traveling on it belonged to Punjab, they were not Canadians, but they were Indo-Canadians. So maybe the interest of the agencies was not to an optimum level.
Well, let me answer you. You've raised several questions. First, the culprits have been identified. They know who did it. The trouble is proving it in a court of law. The question that floated throughout the Commission and in Canada from the time it happened, would the authorities have acted differently if it had been Air Canada full of white Anglo-Saxons? And your natural instinct is to say sure. But I don't believe that. I think the trouble with Canadians with respect to this accident initially is we didn't identify with it. We knew there was trouble in India, the storming of the temple. We knew there was an assassination. There's a fight in India, and then you hear an Air India plane is blowing up. So the first reaction is, well, it's an Air India tragedy. It's only as it started to unfold that it became obvious that Canada played a very big role, that insofar as the crash was concerned, Air India can be criticized for a few small things, but it was a Canadian problem that Canadians didn't immediately recognize. I don't want to think it was based on racism. I think it was just the unusual circumstances of the fight in India and an Air India plane off the coast of England. There were people had no idea it even landed in Canada. So it's not really a complete answer, but I think that was the mentality.
Yeah. Justice John Major, you have given a lot of recommendations. Like you were saying that you had said that there should be a national security advisor. You also mentioned that there should be, a director of terrorism prosecutions. That's a part of your report. You also go on to say that the Canadian Evidences Act should also be, amended. And then there should be a national security witness protection coordinator. So all these things, the recommendations, they are about creating more institutions. So 26 years down the line, starting from 1985, do you think that the system has not matured enough, and a lot of things which have shaped up gradually? Maybe I was referring to 9/11. After 9/11, there was a kind of expectancy that the things would automatically change, because Canada, which is quite close to US, it witnesses a catastrophic event, a terror act, and then things have got to change. And when the whole world is, crying hoarse about the way the stringent checking measures at the airports, especially in US, have been enforced, and people have been subject to humiliation when it comes to Sikhs, turban Sikhs. So the point remains that hasn't the system evolved itself, that you had to give these recommendations and these institutions which you feel should be, set up right now?
Well, some of them are just recommendations on improving what's there. Many of the recommendations could apply to every country, not only Canada. Immediately, and we'll move to the present, with the death of Osama bin Laden, there may be single cell terrorist reactions. And part of my recommendations is the laxity at most airports. You can walk into the waiting area of your airport, and if you're prepared to commit suicide bomb, you can kill 100 people. The fencing around airports, you could drive through it. I mean, I could go on as I did for a number, but to come back to the core question that you're asking, there has been an improvement in Canada. The proof of that lies in the number of homegrown terrorists that they've managed to uncover. I think that you're correct that 9/11 gave impetus. Everybody got a little more serious when they saw the tragedy, but the system depends so much on goodwill of the people in it, and it always will, but these suggestions I make are an attempt to have the system work even when there may not be goodwill between the two agencies. And remember, there's more than two agencies. There's Transport Canada, there's various insurance considerations, and every country has them. And every country should have that kind of communication.
You're traveling quite in depth about the aviation security aspect. You've been talking about the way how the agencies should be detecting the finances to the terrorist organizations. But when you're talking about the changes in the Canadian Evidences Act or maybe a National Security Witness Protection Coordinator, so we obviously are referring to this 1985 Kanishka bombing case, in which vital witnesses were the key targets of the people, the very people who perpetrated those crimes. This includes Tara Singh here, the murder of this person. The way the agencies went about protecting its witnesses, or the way the seriousness of the issues was not being understood to a certain level. So I think a lot of things you feel are very relevant to the present day context as well. If you go from the reference point of 1985 till 1995, when the investigation was on.
Well, to deal first with the recommendations for changes to the criminal code, we have a very awkward system at the moment where you go first to the federal court and have someone declared a suspected terrorist under what they call Section 38. That court doesn't try him. That court identifies him. Then he moves to another court where he's tried. But before he moves to the other court, he can appeal from the Section 38 order and delay his criminal trial. And he can appeal it several different ways, so that it takes 2 and 3 years before it gets from the federal court to the criminal court. And my recommendation was that one court, the criminal court, should make the determination on the certificate, hear the evidence, give a verdict, and there's only one appeal. That would save 3 or 4 years.
To put it more simply, it was a gap between the intelligence gatherers and the potential users of that intelligence.
Yes.
But as your report points out, the CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Services, and the way they had been, withholding a lot of information from the Royal, Mounted Police of Canada, which meant that potentially there was a total coordination of efforts, that were being a lot of leads which were, being dished out by the perpetrators of this crime went unheeded and unnoticed. So these things, 26 years down the lane, do you think that kind of coordination still, the lack of coordination still does exist?
Well, something that is worth mentioning is that CSIS was in its first year of operation. They weren't staffed properly. Their staff came mainly from the RCMP, who could go for 2 years and then go back to the RCMP. The RCMP was a little resentful of losing national security, and they weren't particularly friendly with the people that joined CSIS. The people that joined CSIS were going into an organization that had not yet been organized. And to give you an example, in Surrey, where a lot of the activity were going on, there was nobody that could speak Punjab, Hindu. The police were white and could be spotted a mile away. And they had wiretaps, but nobody understood the wiretap until they sent it to Ottawa to be translated.
Your report also points out that the kind of, the lapses that you're pointing, or the people in the CSIS would not be able to differentiate a one turban Sikh from the other. When you have such a, fundamental sense of, lack of understanding about the kind of subjects that you're dealing with, and then there are very solid, evidences, like one the intelligence said James Bartleman's, crucial evidence was ignored by a lot of investigators, over all these 20 years. So all these things, they point out to a further bigger concern that was this tragedy underestimated after it had happened also, in terms of the fact that the governments were accountable to the people in terms of bringing the culprits to the book of law?
I think one of the problems I've mentioned it before, the RCMP, who were in charge of the investigation, didn't have a crime scene. Ordinarily, a police officer finds a corpse and he can go from there. Here, the plane was at the bottom of the ocean.
But that's the nature of the tragedy. I mean,
yes,
you'll not be able to find debris.
Of course it is. But it was the largest crash of its kind into the ocean.
At that point in time?
At that point in time. And as a matter of fact, I think it still may be the biggest loss of life in a single plane accident. But in any event, to be kind, I don't think they knew where to start in the investigation. They denied that it was a bomb and kept saying it had to be mechanical failure. And in fact, you had an inquiry here, Justice Kirpal, that dealt mainly with the aircraft. So for the first 8 years, the government was denying liability until they were shown that they were at fault. I may have mentioned in my report that.
What did you interpret this denial on part of the government to accept it per se as an act of terror, as an act of sabotage?
Yeah, well, I comment on it. I say that the fishermen, the Irish and English who rescued bodies, could tell from the smell that it was a bomb, or at least an explosion. But when you get into government, they turn it over to the civil litigation, and you get into what's close to insurance-type settlements, and they're never generous in their initial offer, and then they had no evidence. They felt they had no evidence.
And being a first of its kind accident, it was very, very difficult for the agencies to cope up with the kind of investigations that could have happened.
That's right. Now they made a settlement of sorts with the families of the victims and hoped it would go away. But it seemed to haunt the Canadian conscience all these years. What did happen? And of course, the families maintain their concern, what happened. And different governments would say it had been investigated. Finally, Prime Minister Harper was the first Prime Minister to see that it needed an inquiry. So that's where the inquiry started.
So it goes beyond the incidents. You're talking about the broader
I'm talking about things as they are today.
Yeah.
And things as they were then. Parmar, it took 18 months to get a wiretap.
Exactly.
And you see, democratic countries err frequently in going overboard to protect the rights of everybody. And if it was a totalitarian state, they could come in the middle of the night, get the evidence they want. It's more efficient, but we pay a price to be in a democracy. We don't have to pay as big a price as we do sometimes, but there's always going to be a price, and there's always people that think the bad guys always get away when they forget that it's because the bad guys get away that they're protected.
Certainly, you wait for months to get the wiretaps and crucial evidences and all those things. Coming to the people, the victims and the families, the people who were left behind, about the compensation award. There have been a lot of talk about that compensation being inadequate, and you have also recommended a certain amount, if I'm not wrong, or you have just said that it should be a respectable amount.
What I said, that under the terms of reference, I was not authorized to deal with compensation. But I said in the report there was nothing that prohibited me from commenting on it. And
what made you comment?
Well, the evidence we had was the compensation took far too long, and that it was an insurance approach rather than a victim's approach. And the settlements were negotiated the way you might negotiate a injury from a car accident, that it was business.
Right.
It didn't seem, looking at the record, that there was much sympathy involved. And I thought that that was inadequate. What we heard, and we didn't hear much on the amounts, but they were not huge. There was compensation and people signed releases, but I didn't think that they had dealt with compensation properly. So what my report says is that they should appoint an independent tribunal
To award the compensations.
and look at compensation, and you might use the term ex gratia. That means you don't consider any evidence, you simply, without fault, make compensation. Now, I don't know what that committee is doing. It's a difficult job because it's 25 years later. Some people have died, some have moved, but there's enough around that it can be done.
There are obviously similes, and there will be parallelisms that would be drawn with the Lockerbie, the blast which happened, and in which a state had owned the responsibility, Libya to be precise, and then huge awards of compensation being given. So is that a reference point also to a certain extent? Maybe not to that extent, but certainly the awards being given in Kanishka bombing were far less than what was given in Lockerbie.
Well, that question comes up, but you hear the reply that Lockerbie for years denied any responsibility. Then they wanted to join the League of Nations again. They wanted to get their oil sales. So they put up 2 defendants, and they just gave very generous amounts. I don't think it's a parallel. I don't remember the amounts, but they were millions of dollars.
Yes, yes.
And I think you have to look more carefully. They were not so interested in the victims as they were in getting their oil back in the Western markets. But nonetheless, they moved quickly and they paid generously, so that's something in their favor. We have to move, we have to pay fairly, and we have to err on the side of the victims.
And we're talking about last year, 2010, when the Prime Minister Stephen Harper would formally render an apology for Kanishka. It took quite some time for the Prime Minister to apologize.
Well, if you go through the record, there's expressions of sympathy from almost every government. It's too bad, it's a terrible tragedy, but it stopped short of what looked like an apology. Now, it's interesting that in the recommendations, I didn't recommend that he apologize. I did that for 2 reasons. If I recommend and he apologizes, it looks as though he's just following. Yeah. The apology was his own idea, and it was complete. I wasn't present, but it was a memorial service in Toronto, and it was a heartfelt, sincere apology, I believed.